Good morning, everyone. I'd like to just start by thanking TAAI for inviting me to make this presentation, and I hope that it's going to be something that will be of relevance to everyone here today. Just a bit of introduction about myself. My name is Suzanne Sharrock, and I retired last year, having spent 20 years working for an organisation called Botanic Gardens Conservation International, which is a networking organisation working with botanic gardens around the world, based in London at Kew Gardens. Previous to working with BGCI, I was working more in the agriculture sector, working with Biodiversity International and other organisations with a focus on the conservation of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. So that's just a bit about myself. Just moving on to what I want to talk about today, I want to give a bit of an introduction to botanic gardens around the world and talk a little bit about their history and the relevance to developing agriculture and so on over the years. And then moving on to talk about conserving crop diversity, which is probably the area that is of most relevance to agriculture and your interests. And finally, touching a bit on what botanic gardens are doing, the varied roles of botanic gardens in today's world. So just to start with a bit of an overview about botanic gardens, there are over 3,000 in existence around the world at the moment. They're located in almost every country, and there's a great diversity in terms of size and scope. But in order to be able to define a botanic garden and differentiate it from perhaps an ordinary park or amenity garden, we use the following definition, which is that botanic gardens are institutions holding documented collections of living plants for the purposes of scientific research, conservation, display, and education. So this definition is very much around the collection side of botanic gardens and the documentation of the material that they have in their collections. Just to highlight that the network really is very global. You can see that the dots are present in almost every country in the world, a few gaps perhaps across Africa, and definitely most botanic or the majority of botanic gardens being located in Europe and North America. But having said that, still very much a global network. So as I mentioned, the definition of botanic gardens is around the fact that they have documented collections. And these collections are not just the plants that are on display or the plants that you see when you visit a garden, but they're also botanic gardens. Many botanic gardens have associated herbaria, and they together hold many millions of samples. Also seed banks. So a lot of the material in botanic gardens is also held as seed bank collections. Some gardens have tissue banks, many of them have ethnobotanical collections, and some have DNA libraries. And all of these collections, all the information is stored in databases, which are linked together in various ways. So just to talk a little bit about the earliest European botanic gardens, and there is some argument that some of the gardens in the Middle East and Asia predate these European gardens, but in terms of the sort of formal definition of botanic garden, we tend to think of the original gardens being physic gardens associated with universities, very much focused on the study of medicinal plants, mostly belonging to the medical faculties of universities as opposed to the botany or biology faculties. And these gardens were established, the oldest in Italy was Padua in 1545. It's been at the same site since then, and this is a photo taken in Padua. But also Pisa, which predates Padua but has moved to was moved to its present site a bit later. So from very early days, we had botanic gardens appearing in Europe. And I should mention in the UK, the oldest, a little bit more recent, with Oxford University Botanic Garden being established in 1621, and the Chelsea Physic Garden in 1673. And the Chelsea Physic Garden continues from that time to be focused entirely on medicinal, herbal, and useful plants. So if you have the opportunity to visit either of these gardens, I would very much recommend it. They're both very, very lovely places to go and spend some time. Moving on from the early physic gardens, which were very much focused around medicine and the medicinal use of plants, the Botanic Gardens then moved on to be more involved in the movement of plants from one place to another. And although plant introductions, the sort of movement of plants, does have very early origins, Botanic Gardens became particularly involved in the 18th and 19th centuries. Amongst the key players were the UK, Spain, Portugal, and France, and also the Netherlands, and also their colonial territories. And we can see that there was a real growth in botanic gardens during this period, with only 22 botanic gardens in the British Empire in the early 1800s, of which Kew was already established back in 1759, and has been very active ever since that time. But by 1900 there were over 100 gardens, and French, Dutch and Germans were developing overseas gardens during this period as well. And the goal of many of these gardens was to acclimatise and develop plants that were useful for colonial interest. So it was very much this colonial movement that was behind the growth of many botanic gardens to become centres for moving material from one country to another. And as well as being just acclimatisation centres, many botanic gardens at that time developed nurseries in order to mass propagate plants. So once they'd got a plant that was seemed to be suitable for the local environment, it could be mass propagated, and this led to the development of monocultures such as tea, coffee and cocoa. And I just wanted to give a few examples of what was being tested in these gardens. So, for example, the Jardin des Cédamas in Algeria, which was established in 1832 by the French, we focused on trying to acclimatise vanilla from Martinique, mulberry trees coming from Asia, cotton and new varieties of tobacco. And then we have under the UK establishing the Royal Botanic Garden Peradeniya in Sri Lanka, which focused on plants of economic value such as quinine and tea, and I'll talk a little bit more about the quinine story in a minute. And Lagos Botanic Garden in Nigeria, which was focused on looking at growing coffee, cocoa and cotton. So you can see the major commodity crops being very much the focus of the work of these botanic gardens. In India, a number of gardens were established by the British, and they were used to test economic plants from Southeast Asia, including cinnamon and black pepper. They had growing the Opuntia, prickly pear cactus, which was native to Mexico, and the host plant for the cochineal industry, producing a dye that was very important for the growing textile industry in India. And given the rivalry between Spain and Britain at that time, being able to break the monopoly that Mexico had on the cultivation and production of cochineal dye was considered to be something of importance. The British also, by the way, introduced Opuntia to Australia in 1788. In this case, the cochineal insects failed to survive, so it wasn't any use in terms of producing the dye. But the plant itself established so well that it became invasive, and it took some efforts to eradicate it over the following years. Indian botanic gardens were also instrumental in the development of the Indian tea industry. They've introduced many different varieties and various types from China, and looked to find the ones that were most suited to the climate in India, and started the establishment of the Indian tea industry. Just to give a couple of more specific examples, we have the example of rubber, which was originally growing only in the Amazon, and following the discovery of the vulcanization process led to a rubber boom in Brazil and Peru. And although attempts were made to grow rubber outside Brazil, with some seedlings germinating at Kew, these were then sent on to India, but they failed to establish. Following the development of the Wardian case, which made it much easier to move material around, gave a much better survival rate on these long voyages, around 70,000 seeds were smuggled out of Brazil by Henry Wickham, and a number of these seedlings were sent to Sri Lanka. and also to Singapore Botanic Garden. And it was from these seedlings that plants were propagated and sent further around Indonesia and Malaysia. And by 1898, a rubber plantation was established in Malaysia. So this was purely due to the efforts of botanists smuggling material out and then being able to have the gardens at Kew as a germination centre, and then being able to have a way of transporting live seedlings on these long voyages to Southeast Asia. So that was illustrating the particular role of Kew in terms of the development of the rubber industry. And then similarly with quinine, another species that was considered very important for supporting the colonies in the tropics, and again originating in South America. And it was only following the smuggling of cinchona seeds out of South America that allowed the quinine to be established in India, and was developed in India and Sri Lanka, and became a hugely important plant in supporting the colonization of tropical areas. So that's sort of a bit of an introduction to the sort of early roles of botanic gardens and their role in supporting the development of some of the major commodity crops during colonial times. Now I'd like to move on to talk a bit more about botanic gardens and agriculture today. And first of all, a little bit about the number of plant species that there are and how many of these are useful. So we know from the work that's been carried out by a number of botanic gardens around the world that there are around 370,000 known plant species. But amongst these, around 15,000 are considered to be economic plants, and these are listed in the World Economic Plants database. Amongst these, around 7,000 are considered socioeconomically or culturally useful, and about half of those have a direct use as food or fodder or use in crop breeding. And a recent study was carried out by a number of agricultural centres or agricultural scientists who were looking at how well these socioeconomically useful plants were being conserved by the crop gene banks, and they worked out that only 3 out of every 100 were considered to be effectively conserved, looking at both in situ and ex situ conservation. So there was quite concerned that there's a lot of material out there that is of use for food and fodder and so on, but we're not sure that it's being properly conserved and will be continue to be available in the future. However, this work was carried out by, as I say, looking at crop gene banks, and what they didn't look at was the collections that are held by botanic gardens. Botanic gardens have a central database called Plant Search, which is managed by BGCI, Botanic Gardens Conservation International. And this database brings together information on the plant collections of botanic gardens around the world. And the analysis of the data in Plant Search has shown that about a third of all known plant species are held in botanic garden collections, mostly as living plants, but also in some cases as seeds. And you can see from the chart here that 30% of species and almost 60% of plant genera are represented in botanic garden collections, and around 40% of known threatened plants are also in these collections. So the data from Plant Search is showing that there's a very wide diversity of plants being held in botanic garden collections. And following the study that was done on the agricultural gene banks and how many of the socioeconomically important crops are being held in gene banks, we wanted to look at how the botanic garden gene banks compared with the crop gene banks. And we discovered that of the almost 7,000 socioeconomically important taxa, just over 6,000 are found in the living and seed collections of Botanic Gardens and Arboreta, and 21% of these are actually held in more than 40 collections. So it's not like you've got just one plant being held in one collection, but many of these plants are being held in many collections around the world. We also were interested in whether these plants are actually these species are actually threatened in the wild or not. And while the study carried out by the crop community suggested that a very high percentage of the economic plant taxa were of medium or high conservation priority, when we looked at the information that the Botanic Gardens hold and the botanical surveys that have been carried out on these plants, we found that only just over 1,000 have actual information that shows whether they're threatened at national or international level. So there's a lot of information that is held within the Botanic Garden community, which is perhaps not feeding through to the agricultural community, which relates to plants that are of importance to agriculture. And we feel that the Botanic Garden and Arboretum community can contribute significantly to plant conservation and sustainable development. And that includes data and material from the collections of socioeconomically important taxa that are not present in the crop and, for that matter, the forestry communities. So I want to go on to talk a little bit about Botanic Gardens and crop wild relatives. And as Maria Hager, the previous executive director of the Crop Trust, said, if we are to feed a growing population despite climate change, we need to make our food crops more resilient, and crop wild relatives can help breeders climate-proof agriculture. So I'm sure you're all well aware that the human involvement and breeding of plants over the last millennia, last few thousand years, has led to the development of high yielding and nutritious crops. But that process of breeding has resulted in narrowing their genetic diversity and making them more susceptible to pests, diseases, and extreme climatic conditions. So in recognition of this, in 2013, the Crop Trust entered into a collaboration with the Millennium Seed Bank of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and national partners around the world to find, collect, and conserve the endangered wild relatives of 28 important food and forage crops. So this project, called Adapting Agriculture to Climate Change, is a good example, and perhaps one of the few examples, where the crop community and the Botanic Garden community have come together to work on specifically the collecting and conservation of crop wild relatives. And just to give you a bit of information about what happened as a result of that project, 371 different species were collected, with Kew, so Royal Botanic Gardens Kew's most contribution to the project was developing collecting guides and training partners in plant collecting, identification, and seed storage. So the Kew's Millennium Seed Bank also provides long-term storage and safety duplication for seed samples. Passport data is of the species that have been collected, or the taxa that have been collected, is publicly available through the online platform Genesis, which is managed by the Crop Trust. And the top five genera that were collected were Solanum, Vicia, Medicago, Hordeum, and Oryza. So this is a very useful collaboration between the Botanic Garden and the botanical knowledge that is held in the Botanic Garden with the crop community in terms of determining which species they wanted to focus on. And it was very much a global effort, and as you can see, a wide number of countries were involved. Many of them, a number of countries would have wild relatives of a whole range of species, but some species are found in only one or two countries. And I just wanted to talk a bit about the benefits of collaboration, and taking aubergine as an example. So this is one of the genera. Solanum was one of the genera that was the focus for the Adapting Agriculture to Climate Change project. And a number of wild relatives of Solanum were collected through the project in a number of countries in Central America, as well as in Asia and in Africa. And these wild relatives had never before been collected, and their material had never been made available for analysis. So finding and conserving them makes them available to the global scientific community for the first time. And not only is it a collaboration in terms of collecting the material and making it available, but the fact that the Botanic Garden was involved in that meant that they were also working with FERA, the Food and Environment Research Agency in the UK, which was interested in looking at the potential of seeds to harbour plant pathogens and particularly viruses. So they took the advantage of having these aubergine seeds of aubergine wild relatives in the Millennium Seed Bank, and they tested a number of samples for potato spindle tuber viroid. And of the samples tested, 8 were found to be infected with this viroid. Now, this is interesting because the hosts for this viroid had never been recorded as being infected by this pathogen before. The seed had been collected in East Africa, and the virus had never been recorded there before. So there are implications for food production and food security in this region, knowing now that this virus exists. But also, we would never have known about this at all if it hadn't been for the fact that we had a wide range of partners involved in a collaboration, and bringing the various skills of the different organisations together really allows the scientific knowledge to develop. So just to move on to talk a little bit more about some of the other work that Botanic Gardens are doing, looking at the plant diversity that they have in their collections. And so, for example, a number of gardens are looking at the identification of natural pesticides and other biochemicals that can be found in wild plants. Kew is working with farmer research networks in Africa to identify plants with natural insect repellent properties that can be used in crop and seed production. And they've identified a particular compound produced by the larch, and they're using that to try to, on a commercial basis, develop a fungicide to protect grapevines against downy mildew. Many botanic gardens are also involved in looking at studies on how to integrate biodiversity to support agricultural systems. So they're looking at the diversity of plants that can live together within an agricultural system in order to enhance the biodiversity. And as we know, there's a great push now to have more biodiversity amongst agricultural systems to support pollinators and to helping to control pests and diseases and so on. And as part of that, also studying indigenous food systems and the role of local crops in agricultural resilience. So there's a whole range of studies that are looking at agriculture in the broader sense that involve the botanical expertise of Botanic Gardens. Botanic Gardens are also involved in situ conservation and looking particularly at exploring, documenting and protecting agricultural heritage. So they've been in many countries working with local partners to identify and support efforts to identify where important crop diversity might exist. So looking at where native species and land races exist and maybe are under threat. An example is particularly with fonio in West Africa. So looking at to ensure the conservation of in situ of areas that have particular plant diversity which can support food security. And one of the programs that is being promoted at the moment is this Tropical Important Plant Area program, in which Botanic Gardens are working with local partners to identify specific areas that could be to promote their conservation through protected areas as ways of conserving agricultural diversity. And I just wanted to also focus a little bit on some of the other initiatives that are going on amongst Botanic Gardens that are relevant for agriculture. So coffee is the case in point, where Denver Botanic Garden in the US has what's called the Center for Global Initiatives, and this center has led the development of a global coffee conservation strategy, and they're supporting coffee research projects in Puerto Rico, South Sudan, Panama and Ethiopia at the moment. So this is a botanic garden that is very much taking a lead on conservation and research on a major commodity crop. Similarly, in Hawaii, the Breadfruit Institute is based at the National Tropical Botanic Garden, and this promotes the conservation, study and use of breadfruit for food and reforestation. They have a very broad collection, very diverse collection of breadfruit varieties from across the Pacific and wider, and also looking at demonstrating how to use breadfruit in agroforestry, programs and developing links with the local community to promote diverse food systems and sustainability. So just finally, a little bit about how these botanic garden plant collections can be used in slightly different ways. It should be noted that many of the plants growing in botanic garden collections are growing outside their native range, and therefore these sort of exotic plants can be used as sentinels in pest and disease research and also in climate change studies. So in terms of the sentinel idea, the International Plant Sentinel Network is a network of botanic gardens that are collaborating to monitor pests and diseases on the plants in their collections. And again, it's focused on pests and diseases affecting exotic species. So trying to provide a sort of early warning. An exotic species in a botanic garden can be come into contact with a pest or disease that it may not meet in its native environment. So it's useful to know how that plant will react to a particular pest and build up this body of knowledge around pest-host relationships. So, for example, the emerald ash borer is a beetle that has been causing devastation on American ash trees, and it originated in Asia, and it doesn't really have much of an impact on Asian ash trees. But had we been able to see American ash trees, perhaps in botanic garden collections in China, where the emerald ash borer originated, we might have seen that that the American ash was very susceptible to this pest and be pre-warned as to what would happen when the ash borer would be introduced to America. So the idea being that we can start to build up this sort of whole series of early warning systems in place. Similarly, for climate assessment, we can use the fact that botanic gardens are being grown in collections outside of their native range to get an idea of their adaptability to perhaps future climate scenarios. And we can use that. We have a climate assessment tool which will show for species, in this case Acer acuminata, growing in a collection in the UK. It's in the green shows it's in its most suitable environment at the moment, but we could look at that same location under future climate change scenarios and see that it's no longer ideally situated, and we can identify places that might be better suited to this species in the future. And one thing that we mustn't forget, of course, is that botanic gardens are major visitor attractions. It's estimated that the world's botanic gardens receive over 750 million visitors per year. And one of the ways in which we can help to inform the public about the importance of conserving crop diversity is through these exhibitions and engaging the public around this topic. And the Crop Trust has developed a campaign called Food Forever, which is helping to get the global community involved in understanding and conserving food diversity, and through that agricultural biodiversity. And they've developed a sort of travelling exhibition with a series of panels and information that botanic gardens can host to get the word out about the importance of conserving crops and crop diversity. So I'd just like to finish by saying that botanic gardens exist in almost every country around the world. They're very diverse institutes. They're focused on plant identification, conservation, research, education and public awareness. Through their long history, they've always been associated with the cultivation and use of plants for humans, and they have the collections that they maintain have a range of research uses. They play very much a complementary role to the agricultural research centres and crop gene banks, and provide what I think is probably an important and often overlooked resource for the agriculture sector. So I hope that that gave you a bit of an idea about the work of botanic gardens, and be happy to take any questions. Thank you for your attention.